जब जब हम धोएंगे हैंड वॉश या साबुन से हाथ, लड़ेंगे हम जंग कोरोना वायरस के खिलाफ। सैवलॉन।
Hello and welcome to Expressions presented by the New Indian Express in Savlon. I have with me Krishna Udayakumar. He's from Duke University and he set up two very interesting institutions. One is, of course, the Health Innovation Center, and the other is a health center, the Center for Health at Duke University, if I'm not mistaken. Dr. Udayakumar, welcome and thank you so much for joining us. It's a very critical time for the world, but especially for India. And you've been watching some of the developments of late in India. And I wonder, what are the thoughts that come to you first? Because the first wave looked like, we got it covered. We seem to have handled it well. And then suddenly we seem to be all at sea. But surely it's not just by accident. There are obviously huge flaws in management, huge flaws in leadership. Could you walk us through some of what you think went wrong with the way India handled things?
Sure. First, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk with you today and this audience. What we're seeing from around the world, and especially what's happening in India, is certainly heartbreaking. I think so much loss of life, so much disruption that could have been avoided.
And you were born in Bangalore, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Udayakumar, right? So you have...
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
so I still very much...
Guys here, yes.
Yes, I still very much consider Bangalore my hometown, even though I moved to the U.S. when I was 7, but very close relationships and relatives still there. So it makes it even more personally heartbreaking to see what's happening there to friends, to family, to loved ones, and to many, many people. I think we had a good narrative in India about how it was able to deal with the first few months of the pandemic, even the first surge that we saw, the first wave that happened last year. Unfortunately, I think instead of feeling a sense of urgency to prepare for what would inevitably be a second wave of infections, what we saw instead, especially among political leadership, was complacency, premature declaration of victory over the pandemic. And so what we've really seen is this divergence on one hand between science and science-based public health approaches, which is what the best responses have really centered on. And on the other hand, where we've seen political leadership diverge from that science and move toward either reopening too quickly or failing to follow evidence-based guidelines. That's certainly not just for India. We've seen the same happen in the US. We're hearing this week about some decision-making in the UK that follows the same lines. So many countries around the world, unfortunately, have moved in a path that has led to much greater loss of life relative to what we could have achieved.
Right. And Doctor, when you look at some of the innovations that you're working on, that the university is working on, clearly the health system in many countries, but especially in India, was broken. Everybody knew that. So perhaps the time that we had last year could have been used to make some improvements, not long-term for sure. That requires an enormous amount of investment and long-term planning. But surely there could have been some short-term innovations that we could have thought of. And everybody was already highlighting the issue of ICU beds, oxygen. So what were the things that you feel, and you still feel, that we can do to fix this real, trauma that people are unnecessarily exposed to?
Yes, you're exactly right. There's some things that could have been done, but if we focus on what we can do today, in the next week, in the next month,
Exactly.
I would say first and foremost, we really have to figure out how to shore up and stabilize the health system. In many places across India, what initially happened in cities and now is spreading across rural parts of India with this new wave of infections is really leading to the disruption, the collapse of many functioning health systems. So we have to figure out everything from getting enough health workers, backing them up with what they need, but getting basic supplies, testing, personal protective equipment, oxygen, all of the things that really require systems in place and infrastructure. There is perhaps too little too late, but at least some inflow of aid from countries around the world that are coming to India. We also have to get an efficient and effective system to get all of that aid distributed to where it's most needed, with decisions that are not based on political preferences. So first and foremost, how do we shore up the health system so that we can reduce the loss of life and we can reduce bad health outcomes as quickly as possible? Secondly, how can we be sure that we're reinvigorating our response based on evidence? So it's both about what we do that's required, but also what we don't do. We know that there are many things that are happening that have clear evidence against them. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're starting to see overuse of steroids that are leading to increasing cases of mucormycosis and other related conditions. We're starting to see an overuse of different antibiotics and therapies other than the settings where we know they work. So in addition to making sure we're using everything that's required, we have to also be sure that we're following the evidence and not using the things that we know do not work in this response. Third, we have to figure out, how do we temporize this situation over the next 3 to 6 months, because that's at least how long it's going to take to roll out vaccines, which are ultimately where we need to get to. But we will not have enough vaccines to get a substantive amount of people in India vaccinated anytime in the next 3, maybe even 6 months. So how do we stabilize by following adequate public health measures, lockdowns right now, but those can't be sustainable for months to years? Yeah. How do we make sure that we have other systems in place, including more robust testing, as well as quarantine systems, as well as masking, spacing where available, all of the mitigation strategies. And then finally, we do have to figure out how we get more vaccines manufactured and delivered in India.
Right. So there are really many levels of response. And the problem in India has also been, either there's too much centralization or there's, too much decentralization. We don't seem to have a happy medium. For instance, in vaccines, they decided let each state, bid for vaccines, and it hasn't worked. You obviously need to centralize acquisition and decentralize distribution. But these decisions are just not happening at the right time in the right way. So if you were to give us a roadmap for the next 3 or 4 months, you've already told us what doesn't need to be done. You said don't overuse steroids, don't overuse antibiotics. And also, I think, watch what's happening, watch the responses, because, now there are new things like the black fungus and the white fungus. Those are causing fresh panic. So what are the things that you feel absolutely must be done?
Right. If we talk about vaccines for a minute, we know that there is a very strong domestic manufacturing base in India. The question is, how do we continue to ramp that up? Our estimate is right now, both Serum Institute of India and Bharat Biotech are able to manufacture somewhere in the range of 70 to 80 million doses a month. How do we ramp that up as quickly as possible? And some of that means we have to fix global supply chain. Secondly, are there vaccines available outside of India that can come in and help to support the response? We've just seen this week that Pfizer had announced potentially 50 million doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine to be made available over the coming months. There doesn't seem to be a huge amount of additional vaccine supply internationally either. So I think it's really going to have to be, how do we continue to ramp up domestic manufacturing and make sure that on the distribution side, you're right. So creating a free-for-all where the central government, the state governments, and the private sector are all operating in parallel has not led to good outcomes, and certainly has not led to equitable access. So how do we make sure we continue to prioritize the people that are most at risk, both of having bad outcomes, but also transmission?
Right.
and make sure that we're getting vaccines in the limited supply that we have to the people that it can help the most. So making sure that people either geographically or because of socioeconomic reasons don't have ready access, and creating mechanisms to support them are all pieces that are going to be needed over the coming months.
Right. So, how did India go from? I know this is a question that is put to you quite often. How did India go from being the vaccine manufacturer for the world to being the biggest vaccine disaster? How did that happen?
Yeah, frankly, it's in the sheer size of the population, right? You're right that there's much to be proud of in India in terms of the manufacturing base, including this manufacturing workhorse for much of the world.
Right.
If India had been able to keep the pandemic in terms of cases and deaths at bay for another 6 months or so, it would be a massive global success story because it would have given time to ramp up vaccine manufacturing even further, given time to get enough doses for high risk individuals and populations in India, and served as the vaccine power force to make sure that the rest of the world also gets access.
Yeah.
Right now, there is a humanitarian crisis in India, and rightly so. The domestic manufacturing has been purposed for domestic needs,
Right.
but it has downstream consequences that all of the almost 100 countries getting vaccines from COVAX through the AMC model, the 100 or so poorest countries in the world, now also don't get access to the vaccines because they were predominantly relying on manufacturing in India by the Serum Institute for their access. So we're seeing, unfortunately, a disaster unfolding in India that's going to continue for weeks. And downstream, it's led to a lack of access to vaccines for much of the rest of the world.
Right. So, do you feel that we didn't use the time between the first lockdown, the first wave, and the second wave? Should we not have ramped up our capacity then? We could have.
Yes, you're exactly right. And so much of this pandemic story is about wasted time. In the early days of the pandemic, much of the world didn't take urgently enough the risk that was bearing down on us. Similarly, between first, second, third, or fourth waves in different parts of the world, we didn't take seriously and urgently enough the need to prepare for the next one. In the US, we felt unfortunately too comfortable having gone through the first 2 to 3 waves, and then we had a horrendous wave over our winter that we're still recovering from. So this is not a unique story in India, but unfortunately is one that's played out in too many countries around the world of wasting what little time we had to prepare and respond proactively.
Going forward, Doctor, we will, of course, be seeing, and everyone tells us that, everyone who knows science tells us that we'll be seeing many more epidemics, we'll be seeing many more outbreaks such as this. What are the things that we can do to be more flexible and more nimble in our approach?
Yeah, I'd say, looking forward, this has to lead to some better lessons learned and better preparedness for future global health security threats, especially pandemics. And first, we have to have stronger surveillance systems in place. So can we pick up emerging infections a week into their development instead of a month or 6 months later? So how do we set up a very robust surveillance system in place that can serve as our eyes and ears and raise the alarm as quickly as possible? Secondly, I think we have to strengthen our health systems to be more resilient and more prepared. Third, we have to have some excess capacity in the system. I think what we saw was that a system globally that was built on consolidation and efficiency, while it works most of the time, falls apart, especially during times of crisis. So we do need to decentralize and regionalize our vaccine manufacturing capacity and some other capacities around the world. So now we're looking at both in India, but other parts of Asia, in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, can we create manufacturing hubs so that even if it's not in 6 months, maybe it's in 18 months, whatever time it takes, we're building capacity in a more decentralized way that, one, can ramp up more quickly, but also, two, lead to more equitable access. So India is in some ways better positioned because there is domestic access. The situation, I think, would have been even worse if India had to wait for vaccines to be donated by rich countries, by high-income countries to get there at all. So even with that manufacturing base in India, we've seen the struggles that's been magnified in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, where there's no manufacturing capacity at all.
That's right. And, in many ways, the response to the vaccine globally has been a triumph as well. I mean, we've never seen, I think, a vaccine for a disease produced this fast, right? I mean, I think we've been struggling with the HIV vaccine for years. We haven't really come up with anything. Cancer is still, incurable. So in many ways, and I think that was really a result of a global partnership between private players, countries. Are there lessons in the way we produce the vaccine, and can we adopt them for other innovations in healthcare, in distribution? As you said, decentralizing is one.
Absolutely. And you're right. So there's been a triumph of science over the last 15 months, right? And a failure of leadership and political will playing out in parallel. It's amazing that we've gone from identifying a new pathogen to having a safe, effective vaccine. In fact, several safe and effective vaccines in a year, which has never been done in history.
It's
And
unprecedented.
at the same time, we've done a really poor job of creating leadership, solidarity, all of the things of implementing the science as quickly as we could.
Right.
So going forward, the lesson that we have to learn around the world is that we have to follow the science, even when we may not like what it's telling us, that we have to operate from the same fact base to make decisions and to bring people together. The technical lessons we should learn, certainly one, that the mRNA platform for vaccine development has proven itself phenomenally. So we do, I think, need to see a stronger manufacturing base specifically of the mRNA platform, because those will be effective not just for coronavirus right now, but I suspect for other reasons going forward. So I think that's been a great component of what we've seen in scientific development over the last year.
And India's done quite well in that, hasn't it?
Yes, I think both from the manufacturing base, which was already strong and growing further, to the frankly, the innovation that's coming from India is also, as it has been for many years now, continuing to lead the world. The vaccine developed by Bharat Biotech with ICMR, right, is an Indian-developed, safe and effective vaccine from all the data we've seen so far. There are additional vaccines under development by BioE, by Zydus Cadila, and others. And we are going to see, I think, some really interesting second and third generation vaccines emerge, and many of them from India.
Right. Is there a lot of work being done in immunity as well, I believe, in developing immunity to such viruses in India, which is cutting edge?
There are. I think, there's a very strong base of science in India, again, that we should be very proud of and as part of a very strong global enterprise. So in looking at everything from the science of immunity, how long natural immunity versus the vaccine-mediated immunity might last, when we might need boosters, all of those things, I think certainly India is playing a role in generating the evidence that's going to lead to better decisions around the world.
As a scientist, as a doctor, when you see that wave of anti-intellectualism clearly having been defeated, and yet people still sticking to these old ways of thinking. In India recently, well, just a couple of days ago, there's been a huge controversy about a spiritual guru who's talked about how, homeopathy is the answer, and allopathy has really brought us to where we are currently. And the Indian Medical Association director has taken huge offense, in fact, sued him. But to still see that people like him have the power to sway millions. And as you said, this vaccine, this epidemic has taught us to follow the science. Why do we still not follow the science?
Yes, that's a great question and one that frustrates many of us. And I think to be humble is very important, that we have to make sure we're building connections and trust in addition to building the evidence base. So what we've seen, whether it's the anti-intellectualism, which you're exactly right about, or populism playing out to, unfortunately, some of the same effects, really shows us that not just the message and the evidence matters, but the messengers matter. So you have to be very purposeful about building community, building trust, especially with those that may have inherent distrust of intellectuals, of scientists, of the science itself, and find partners that will allow for growth of trust over time. What that means now is that we have to start working on things like vaccine confidence and vaccine hesitancy. We have to deal aggressively with the misinformation that's floating around, that's even more easily distributed through social media channels around the world. So the message matters, but the messengers also matter. So how can we work now to build vaccine confidence amongst all populations? Because it really should matter what your political ideology is in terms of the COVID getting disease or not, or in terms of accepting the vaccine or not. But we know that there are many reasons people have hesitancy about vaccines in general or about this vaccine. So the more we can do proactively and with a spirit of collaboration and humility, I think will serve us best.
Right. The medical profession itself has really suffered a lot in India. There have been so many deaths. It's been very traumatic. They've been exposed to tragedy at a scale that I think many could not even have imagined. They've been confronted with so much. Yet there are things that we really need to fix with the profession in the country. And we've had a new architecture of medical education in India as well while all this was going on. And yet, as I said, one hears of terrible instances like, say, ventilators being available in small towns and villages, and people not actually, trained staff not actually being available to use them. So there's obviously a huge gap, which hopefully this new medical architecture, medical education architecture will address, a huge skill gap. What are the things that you would recommend? Not everything requires a degree. Sometimes even a ward boy can be trained to use these things. So, what would you say? What are the innovations that you would recommend?
Yeah, right. I think we've seen a horrendous toll on health workers, frontline critical workers around the world, especially in India over the past few weeks to months. We've seen many deaths. We've seen the mental trauma, the physical trauma that they've gone through, which is another underappreciated terrible consequence of the
Right.
pandemic in India and around the world. Um, how do we help support in the short term? How do we help to deal with the mental health needs of our health workers? How do we get past the stigma of talking about mental health needs? I think are things in the short term that we have to really worry about. We also have to make sure that we're moving from our current model. As you said, there is now an emerging new architecture for health professions, so at least for physicians in India. But how do we think about health professions as a broadly defined category that are much more about competency-based training? I think that's where much of the world is headed moving forward. That you're right, even in high income countries, it's not going to be doctors and nurses as the only health professions to serve the needs of most of the population. So how do we expand that to really make sure that we're capturing frontline health workers, whether those are ASHAs, community health workers, others in that context, and making sure that we're empowering them, creating the skills, the competencies that are required, and matching those with what are needed in urban, rural, or other types of settings. So we are in the midst of rethinking what that future of health professions should look like around the world. We've just seen a professionalization of community health workers, which has been needed for many years. We know that it's an undercompensated often voluntary role, even though it's a real job.
Enormously undercompensated. Even with
Yes.
a recent pay hike, I think their salaries are usually just about 1,000 rupees a month, and they really are, as you said, the front line. They're the people who actually go from house to house in villages and check out how people are.
Yes, so we have to, make it a profession. We have to create the professionalism, the respect for the profession, and then the appropriate compensation. I think that's the only way it can be sustainable over time.
Right. And we have to create a paramedical sort of staff as well? I mean, something that is between the doctors, the nurses, and then another level of staff which can be trained to do basic things.
Yes, I do think we need a broader array of health professionals that are all working at the top of their skill set and competencies. Um, we're not going to get away from the need for doctors, for nurses, but in the US, we have models of physician assistants, a model that was actually created here at Duke University. We've got models of nurse practitioners, other health professionals that are frontline providers of care, are very competent, are professional health providers. And I think that's globally what we need to get to, but also recognizing that the model of community health workers has been put into practice at scale in many places. So we should learn, certainly not just from the US, but from the experience in India and in extending some of these health workers as well as other parts of the world.
Doctor, when you look around the world, which are the countries you think that India or indeed any other country struggling with this can really learn from in terms of the best practice in how people dealt with it, the best practice in terms of vaccine? Could you just sort of do a little best practices for us so that we know going forward what are the things we can learn from?
Yeah, and I think there are many learnings that we should draw upon, perhaps in different ways. So what we saw were that countries, especially in Southeast Asia, that had prior recent experience with things like SARS,
Right.
were better prepared for a very robust public health response. So they were able to move quickly, have some centralized decision making, but allowed a mechanism by which there was sharing of information transparently, a ramping up of testing. So those types of models, I think, are good to learn from in terms of what does a national coordinated public health response look like. On the other hand, we've seen countries that struggled with control, like Israel, actually then showcase what does it mean to vaccinate very quickly. And they were aided because there was a highly functioning health system, an integrated electronic health record, and the ability to get access to vaccines. Again, it's hard to do at scale, but Israel, for a population of 9 million, was able to do it quickly.
Yeah.
What the US has done in implementing vaccinations once we got through the supply challenges has also been impressive. So I'd say for public health response, there are some countries to learn from, many in Southeast Asia. If you look at New Zealand and Australia, I think they've done well in that regard as well. And then on the vaccination front, a different set of countries, partially driven by access to supply early and partially driven by the urgency where they had to vaccinate more quickly to get control of the infections in their populations. So all of those are things we can learn from, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to having enough resources, but also taking strong evidence-based decisions from the political leadership that makes a difference.
I've been struck by the peculiarity of Japan. It has a vaccination rate of as low as 4%. That surprises me in a country that is, aware of disasters, aware of, has a huge sense, at least one thinks of hygiene and, sort of public hygiene. What explains that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Japan has done really well until recently.
Yeah.
So what we saw were very clear public communications about washing hands, wearing masks, distancing were possible, but in many cases the distancing wasn't possible. So they relied on a lot of other health measures, public health implementation that was able to manage infections for a period of time. And what we're now seeing is a rise in infections in parts of Japan that have required even more stringent restrictions to be put into place.
Right.
And they have struggled with access to vaccines as quickly because there's not a strong base of vaccine manufacturing yet in Japan. I think that's being built up. And so because they haven't had access to vaccines, they have relied to date successfully, but I think some concerning trends now, and I think what that shows is that nobody's really safe, even if you put very strong public health measures in place, just given the characteristics of this disease and the emerging variants, you're going to have to monitor very closely and take very smart, proactive measures to regain control when you see surges happen.
Right. Dr. Udayakumar, the last question really, everybody talks about returning to normalcy, the new normal. I mean, will there ever be anything called normalcy again? I mean, we will have to live this way, masked up, sanitized, I mean, socially distanced. These are now things that have to be ingrained in us, right?
They do. I hope very much that at least in a couple of years, we'll get back to something we consider very close to normal. It may look very different than what we might have called normal 3 years ago. I do think we've learned that the interconnectedness around the world is incredibly positive, but also comes with some risks that we have to manage over time. We do have to be very sensitive that we have to make sure that we don't end up with a world with haves and have-nots.
Yeah.
What we've seen with vaccine access right now is that almost all of the vaccines are going to high-income countries and a handful of middle-income countries. And if that's the way vaccinations play out for the next 12 to 18 months, we really will see part of the world moving forward and part of the world left behind. And that would be a terrible shame. And what we're trying to make sure happens is a much more globally cohesive response that has equity and global equity really as its anchor point, because that's the only way any of us are going to move past this pandemic.
Right. And we will see newer virus strains. Is that a given?
Yes, I think so long as the virus continues to rage around the world, we will see new variants emerge. And we have seen that happen in the UK, in South Africa, in Brazil, in India. And I unfortunately don't think those will be the last by any means, because we're seeing rates of infection that are concerning in many, many parts of the world.
Right. So is there one message you'd like to give the leadership across the world? What do they really have to do? Because eventually citizens of any country can only do so much. Eventually it is left to the leadership in every country to decide which way forward.
Yeah, my message would be very simple and clear. Act with the greatest urgency possible and think about global response, because it's only a global response that will be effective against a global pandemic. We cannot think just about national response. Even if we get to high rates of vaccinations in the US, we will not be safe in terms of our own health, in terms of our own economic recovery, certainly not in terms of our ethical or humanitarian mandate to make sure that we're being a strong partner to the rest of the world. So I would say no matter where you live, acting urgently is going to be really important, and making sure that we are thinking about not just ourselves, but also about our neighbors.
Right. And don't declare victory too soon.
Absolutely. None of us should be in a place of declaring victory anytime soon.
Right. We really have to just buckle down and just, get through this, and then eventually create an architecture that works. And, those are obvious things. But again, do you think we need to remind leaders across the world what is the most obvious thing? You have to invest in health. Just do that.
Yes, absolutely. And And now we're seeing the World Health Assembly, the G20 Global Health Summit just happened last week. In just about 2 weeks, we're going to see the G7 Leaders Summit in the UK. There's going to be a COVAX Japan-hosted meeting at the end of June. So these are all opportunities where global leaders will be together to make sure that they are accepting and sending the right message about really needing a whole new model for global governance and global health for us to be effective going forward. But while we're thinking through that, making sure we don't lose track of the really urgent health and humanitarian needs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Udayakumar. It was really illuminating. And I do hope people out there are listening to this and understanding that, let's not declare victory, or let's not declare defeat either. There are things that we can do to get through this, and then we can think about what to do for the future.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you very much.
जब जब हम धोएंगे हैंड वॉश या साबुन से हाथ, लड़ेंगे हम जंग कोरोना वायरस के खिलाफ। सैवलॉन।